Hi, everyone. Welcome to what we're calling Laurentian Home Companion. We've got an idea for this show that we think is going to be fun. Going to look at some topics roughly around farming and rural life and nature. This is part of the Iron Age Archive family, so we welcome you if you're coming over from that. And if you're new, go and check them out. We'll have a link in our description. My name's Rob. You might know me as Bucklander, and today I'm joined by Erik, who's going to be my co-host on this.
Thanks for having me. And I'm talking to you here from the farm today. We're milking some cows. We're growing some grass for some feed. We were driving tractors today. So I'm the hands-on part of this operation and part of Iron Age Archive and the project that we're a part of. And I'm glad to have you here today and talk about some subjects that maybe people didn't know how important to them, that have been not understood very well, and we're hoping to add to that conversation and solidify its importance in everybody's day-to-day life and some of the changes that are taking place in that now. Some of it's progress and some of it's all progress, but some of it's definitely going back to a time where things were simpler.
And I think that's a good point, because one of the things that we're trying to do in this show is that there's things happening in the world that are revealing fault lines and fracture points and difficulties. One of the underlying ideas that we have for the show is if you're not happy, it probably means you're not happy with cities and being disconnected from nature and real life. And we want to kind of make a case for the rural life on this podcast as much as anything else.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rob, that there's definitely been a promotion towards the cities and the efficiencies of cities. And we all know that cities are great places and they have a lot to offer. They're a sign of civilization, of development, and museums are, you're not going to get the same level of appreciation of art and history in museums in countrysides and major sporting events and musical concerts. And the jobs and bureaucracies that exist in cities don't exist in the rural areas, but we've got a lot more to offer than that. And we're certainly seeing people identify and understand those things. So I'm trying to do my best to explain that a little better and explain and clarify really what's going on in the world and how it relates to everybody, not just those people in rural areas.
And just to put that into perspective, the estimates are that by 2050, 68% of the world's population is going to live in a city. And by the end of the century, 2100, 85% is going to be living in cities. So that's a big number. And I don't want to stop anyone who wants to live in a city living out in the country, because frankly, I want the country to be as nicely depopulated as possible, but I want the people living in the country to want to be there, to have that sort of hearth and home values. I'm going to throw a word out there that some of you might have heard before me using, the Shire. So what we're going to do in this show in terms of the structure is we've got this little intro that we're going to give you now, telling us a little bit about ourselves, who we are, and what we're bringing to the table. And Erik's going to go first on that. But then after that, we're going to go into a day in the life of Erik. He's keeping this little photo diary, and he's going to walk us through what he's been doing since the last time we heard from him. And then we're going to go into what I'm calling the news roundup. That's going to be looking at an overview of news from farming and rural things happening around the world, mainly in the Anglosphere, because I can't read any other language because, English is better than every other language. The rest of them are stupid. Erik will disagree with me on that. And then in the final segment, what we're going to be doing is having a sort of in conversation, where most of the time it's going to be me grilling Erik on a subject that he's knowledgeable about. Sometimes we're going to flip that, and Erik's going to be talking to me, and hopefully we'll get some guests on that me and him will both be able to get into. But to give you an example, we could talk about the process of urbanization that's coming. So anything that you think, hey, that's an interesting topic, I'd like to hear more about that, let us know and we can investigate that. odds are we kind of know that that's something that we need to get into, and we will. We won't just leave anything interesting out there dangling, but if we do, let us know, and we'll get to it at some point. So that's the rough vision, the rough structure of what's going to be happening. Erik, what are you bringing to this? What's your background? What are your concerns? And what do you want to get out of this sort of personally?
That's a good question, and something we wrestle with every day as a farm here out in the city or out in the countryside, out living the rural life. And I just want to be able to share kind of what some of the changes are and hopefully how it relates to people who are listening in on this. And I want to be able to reach out from the rural and reach back and understand, hopefully, people that understand where the food comes from or where the food can come from. It's really isn't that far away. We have lots of experiences here with people from cities that come to visit us and talk to us about different issues. And I want to be able to do that on a broader scale. There's an interest out there in our culture about how our food is being produced, how our land is being used, how rural economies work, how urban economies work, the relationship between the two. Those are the things that I want to discuss and really reiterate the importance of those issues that Rob has an understanding of, and that hopefully we can bring that understanding to other people.
The way I've said this to Erik in the past is I have some experience on farms, so I know enough to ask good questions of Erik, but I don't know the answers. And vice versa, that he knows enough about my area, which is sort of theory and philosophy, and to ask the good questions, but maybe not know the answer. So we're going to be learning things from each other as we do this, as much as hopefully you guys are going to be picking up stuff. So as Erik said, he's practicality. I'm theory. Most of the time, I'm going to be throwing stuff at him. But as I said, occasionally he'll be throwing stuff at me, looking at philosophy or more theoretical stuff or even theology behind all of this. I'm primarily interested in not in farming for its own sake. My concern is how man interacts with the world. Technology comes into that and how it separates us from nature. But we're not going to get rid of technology anytime soon, and we probably shouldn't, because that's part of what makes us man. But I do think we're too much emphasis on the technological. And in saying this, I would want people to think about the city and science as particular forms of technology that are overemphasized at the moment. So we need to rebalance the scales with the Shire, referencing, of course, Tolkien, and a sort of rural utopianism that is out of reach. I know that, I admit that, but it's still worth us trying to work towards. And then as a counterweight to the science, I am working on an idea, what I'm calling craft. Now, when I say craft, what I mean is the sort of skill that doesn't claim to know why. For example, spraying formula A on crop B produces outcome C. That's science. What I mean is we have the grain run this way on this carved piece of wood, and we don't know why, but that's how it's always been done, and it works. Now, I'm going to make a philosophical statement here and say that is real knowledge. That's a contentious issue. Even though there isn't good justification behind it, that's knowledge. And so cities and science go together like the Shire and craft go together. So we're starting this show with more emphasis on farms. Why? Because they're rural and because when done well, they embody that craft that I'm talking about. Note well, we're not a factory farming friendly show. That is injecting science into something that thrives with tradition, that are there because they work, even if the justification for them isn't present to those who practice that craft. And what does science produce? Well, to be cynical, and I think Erik will agree with me on this, that particularly in farming, it produces solutions to problems that science itself previously created. So, to give you an example from a different area, we have Viagra for you because you have erectile dysfunction from the antidepressants you're on, which you need because you stare at spreadsheets all day and never actually live a life and get outdoors. That's the solution science can give us. It's a band aid. So, going back to what I said at the beginning and man interacting with the world, well, we will always need some interaction in the form of food production. So, farming is a great example because that's where the rubber meets the road. What I'm also hoping that the show becomes, and I think and hope Erik agrees with me on this, is as we explore the topic of farming, we will gradually spread out into topics around the rural life in general and nature as well. And this will become propaganda for some incels to get out of the basements in the suburbs and move out to the countries to start living lives worth living. Get married, have kids, accept Jesus, shoot guns, eat meat, live life, love life. And I'm on that journey too myself. Erik is beating us all there. I'm not there yet, but I'm doing everything I can to get there. So I'm not looking down my nose at anyone who isn't there yet. But I'd like to make the sell to them that this is something any sane person who can see the way the world is going should want to make happen for themselves.
You've bit off a lot there, Rob, and those are all great points. And I'll just touch on the last one that you made. And I don't want to come across during any of these presentations as someone who's being superior in any way. We've been very blessed to be able to have these opportunities, my wife and I, and now my children, in working in a generational facility. You know, I owe a lot to my parents and grandparents for getting us, and great grandparents and great great grandparents on both sides of our family for getting us this far. And it's something, but I hope to be able to contribute back to our community and contribute back to other people's communities and help them understand that there are things that are possible and there is another life out there. I'm not without my struggles or imperfections either, but I have a very arduous task ahead of me. And part of that task is going to be able to help bring other people on board and understand the opportunities that rural life but you have to understand it first before you enjoy the benefits of it, because it's a different world here than the urban lifestyle that some of us have become accustomed to and grown sick of. But it's very possible what we can do. We're not looking down on other people who have taken the chance and have chosen to do another direction. But there is something else out there. There is hope. And I think the rural lifestyle can offer that. And you don't have to move in with Uncle Ted either. You don't have to move into the forest and isolate yourself. There are rural communities that are looking for young people to contribute, and there are rural communities that have less of an emphasis on materialism than maybe what you'll find in the urban environments, and will be able to accept a young family or a young person into their community and help them be able to thrive. And ultimately, that's what we're hoping to spread, is the ability for, as most of our audience will be men, I'll say young men that are able and willing to thrive in a rural environment. Those opportunities are there.
Yeah. And you know, if you guys have questions, don't hesitate. I'm sure they might build up and we might do some Q&A episode here and there. And if you're thinking, how do I make this happen? I'm sure we'll do an episode not too far down the line about how to make this happen. But there are no stupid questions, so don't hesitate to ask, because we all have to start somewhere.
Introducing me as the practical application of things. I mean, we do have experience. We're on our farm here. I'm seventh generation. My wife's seventh generation of farm. We're in a partnership. We're a dairy farm. We farm 800 acres and are doing some things towards working closer with the food industry and producing our own food instead of a commodity. And I just want to take an opportunity to kind of give you a bit of information, not necessarily about what I do day to day here, that will come sooner, but a little bit about my ethos and a little bit about how I try and enact what I believe and try and project myself and our family into the future in a sustainable way that's going to last. It's going to last for another 7 generations. And that's, I think, what we're all looking to enact mentally, spiritually, financially. And this isn't a self-help organization. I can't help you do that, but I can share a little bit about what I do day to day. We're going to try and relate it to economic issues. Some of that is going to be environmental issues. Some of those things are going to be social issues and personal issues as well. So I've taken the time to do a journal, and some of my journaling that I've done, a pictorial journal, hopefully we can post it.
On the video on YouTube, you should be able to see them as Erik goes through them. If this is audio, we'll try and get them up somewhere, and that will be in the description below. So you can click on that and have a look at whatever Erik's talking about. Erik, before you get going, give us a 30-second description of the farm.
So multi-generational dairy farm. My wife and I own and operate in Canada, Eastern Canada, East Central Canada. We have about 100 animals here. We have 800 acres. And we have 3 kids, multi-generational, and our goal is to get our farm or our business to the next generation.
And you're primarily dairy. How many liters are you producing a week, a day, a year?
Every week we produce about 15,000 liters of milk, and that milk goes to make different products to be shipped into people to buy at retail outlets mostly in major cities. Our dairy products get turned into butter, into ice cream, into yogurt, into fresh milk, whatever dairy products that are available, we will end up blended together in a large pool and turned into dairy products.
And your herd is, what kind of cows are they?
Well, we have lots of different types of cows. We have cows from Guernsey cows, we have Jersey cows, we have Angus, we have Angus beef cows, we have Holstein, which are dairy cows, and brown Swiss cows.
Is that typical to have a herd mixed like that, or?
No, it's not typical, really. We're a small herd and we try and focus on the content of the milk has to be a certain type or of a certain design. And we've chosen the wide variety of breeds in order to get the content of milk that we produce the way we need to produce it.
Now we'll do an in conversation about milk in a future episode, but needless to say, breeds change the milk that you get, and it has impacts on all sorts of things, producing amounts of milk and quality of milk. But we'll worry about that for a deep dive later on. One last question before you get into your day to day: preferred tractor brand? What's Erik's dream tractor?
Well, if you want to do a tractor geek out, the practical
And
one,
we will be doing I promise you, we will be doing a deep tractor geek out in some episode.
that'll be the fun time, but we're not going to focus on tractor geek out time, but we can focus for a little bit. And the best tractor is the one that runs. So that's the most practical end of things, as practical as you put it. But I am partial generationally to the brand of John Deere tractors. Rob, if you had a tractor, what tractor would you buy?
Probably a case, one of those big case ones. They're pretty cool. But that's just because it looks badass.
If you own it, you got to make the payments. So the bigger you got to have the right. This
Yeah.
is practical, and you got to have the right and the right man, the right understanding of how to do things behind it. So I don't mean to burst your bubble, but I'm going to have to bring you back down to earth, and you got to get the.
That's what this dynamic is. You bringing me back down to earth and me trying to get you to come up into the clouds with me. So, what picture do you want to start with?
Well, today I had an original idea of what we were going to go with and talk about another farmer that kind of shares my views and what they do. But I think what's a little better is to find out, what I do and some of the things that we've done this past spring that I can share with people, and some of the things that we're trying to do. And a picture tells 1,000 words. And I'd reference a picture of my tractor, and you'll see a chunk of sod on that tractor, and I'm cultivating in one of those pictures. This is one of my fields. We'll call it the flower field. And the flower field is always a unique field because it's very wet. The topography of that field is that field's in between a hill and a swamp. So there's topographical pressures there that make that field very wet. And it's very difficult to get to that field. And luckily, it's one of my smallest fields, so I'm not losing a lot if I don't get to it. But I really need to work hard or be diligent to get to that field certain times of the year. So I'm in that field in early June, and I'm tilling up that field to get it ready for planting. And what I'm seeing is the wonderful soil structure in that field. That field has been left alone for probably 60, 70 years. There hasn't been a lot of tillage, and there's been no chemical use or fertilizer in that field. What we're seeing is a clump of roots on a clover plant, and just how the structure of that soil is that you can see and feel in your hand. I can't really describe it, but I can describe to you the field next to it that we've really abused with tillage and chemicals and sprays for the last 30 years anyway. In that field, though, that land is practically a brick. You couldn't pull up a clump of sod like that because you couldn't get out of the ground. It's so hard and lacks such structure and air in the soil. It's so densely packed that it's completely useless. In fact, it almost is barely functional as farmland, barely profitable. In the field like this, I don't have to put any fertilizer. I don't have to put any spray or chemical on it. I have to just do a minimum amount of tillage on it and plant, and off we go. We're off to the races, and we get a great yielding crop, and we have a wonderful, clean crop that we can feed to our cows. But it's not typical of the land that we have, and we're trying to take our land that's built like a rock and turn it back into that type of soil to give it that structure. And we're trying to be better stewards of the environment. A lot of people talk about what they can do for the environment, whether it's purchasing certain products that are environmentally friendly or taxation programs that will help clean up the environment, or devoting their time to environmental work and time and money to environmental organizations to promote the importance of the environment. And those are all wonderful things that we need. And this is our contribution, but this is an actual tangible contribution that we're trying to make to help make the world and society and our local community and our local environment a better place. And I want to make a definition of environment that I think has been perverted. I think that's the right word. The word environment has been perverted in the modern vernacular. And I'd like people to understand what I think, or what my definition of environment. And the environment is somewhere where you can walk during the day. That if you can walk or want to walk from one place where you are right now to another, that's your environment. Your environment isn't somewhere else. Your environment isn't here because you're not here, Rob. Your environment is where you walk to in a day, and the things that are in that environment, all the life. It's a catch-all term that in modern terms, in modern vernacular, means environmentalism. And environmentalism, what it really means is stewardship. And stewardship in the Old English, I believe, is its derivation. Someone will correct me on that. Is the care of the life of the land. And I know that that's my responsibility as a community member and as a member of my community and my chosen profession, that I'm here to steward the land to the next generation. And it's a simple thing to think about, but that's as you're walking from point A to point B, wherever you are in your environment. I want you to think about not being a environmentalist and worrying about somebody else's environment. I want you to think about being a steward and worrying about and understanding better what's in your environment and how you can look after it and care for it. So that's the main principle that I want to take out of this journal. And hopefully these pictures will relate to other topics that we're talking about in the future, in that stewardship is really what I'm trying to allow to succeed. The stewardship of our communities, the stewardship of ourselves personally, and our families, and the land, and the environment that we are ultimately responsible for. That's getting a little preachy, but we're going to talk about other subjects that are very pertinent to everybody's lives in the world of food. That's what we're here to talk about today. Give you a little bit of an introduction or a taste of what you can be expected if you tune in on a regular basis.
For the record, I can't tell you what stewardship means. That's me getting theoretical, and I don't want to do that.
Well, what you can do is you can look at your definition and how you see the world. I'm not asking you to redraw the map, but think about from where you walk to from point A to point B, wherever you need to go to on a regular basis. And what you see, you may see a lot of brick buildings and people and cars and trees. I don't know.
It has a connotation around governance of anything.
Correct.
But as it's becoming used increasingly, it's very much in relation to the land. That's the way we're using it here. If you hear stewardship, that's what we mean by it.
It goes back to the estate ownership when there was a steward on the land who looked after the land. He knew where things were. He understood where crops would grow, where they wouldn't grow. The reason I choose different vernacular than environment is because I think it's overused. And today, we use a lot of different terminology that will fall under the environmental ledger. And I want to create a clearer picture, or try and create a clearer picture as to what it is that I'm trying to do. And stewardship, I think, is a more accurate definition.
And I think what is good about it as a term, in terms of what we want to accomplish, is that it's not anti-human. And so much conversation about environmentalism is anti-human, or you might have heard the term misanthropic, which anthropos is human, mis being against. So when someone calls someone a misanthrope, it means they don't like people. And Extinction Rebellion and those sorts of people are very misanthropic in their approach to the environment, which is basically let people die. Good. Mother Nature is killing us. We're the virus. That sort of narrative. And when we use the word stewardship, what we're doing is we're saying that anything that the environment does, for better or worse, it has to be in relation to humans. Because if it isn't, then there are going to be problems, because we're not going to appreciate the environment in the right way. We're going to just go in and strip mine and strip fell land and do all sorts of shit. So it goes the other way of overly exploiting it, but also, the other way, if you're not doing stewardship, not caring about people. Any solution to the environment has to include people in it, because I'm not interested in committing suicide. I'm not interested in the human race committing suicide for the sake of the planet. So I really like stewardship because it says we need to govern the environment well.
So we entered into that field late May. It was covered in beautiful clover, natural clovers, and some of it planted, some was there. There was a lot of trefoil in that field. I remember going in there and we hit it with the vertical tillage device, which we try and use not very often. But it kind of our choice was is either that or we're using a lot of chemicals, which are very expensive, that we don't want to use, but you have to admit they're very effective in what they do, and they kill a lot of weeds. It takes a lot of work that I'm finding out. This is our first year of without chemical control, or trying to reduce chemical control as much as possible. We always have, but we've made a big leap this year specifically because we don't have the budget to do it, is to cut chemicals out almost completely. Now we have used some, but it's a learning curve. We're trying to figure out, these are big steps a lot of people don't want to make or aren't able to make. We're in a position where we have to make those decisions and we have to start doing those things. And these pictures kind of represent some of that, of what we're doing, and the cover crops that we've included and how we're looking to terminate those cover crops and get a crop in. And this is a month later and this field still isn't planted as of today. We're going to be putting oats, I believe, into that field for feed for our cattle. But really just a beautiful field and environment and that we're in, and we're right between a creek. There's a beautiful pond in front of us and some of those trees that were ducks, and one of my neighbors shot a bear by there recently. So they all go and water themselves into that small bush, which is connected to a larger swamp behind us, which is protected. That's a wildlife preserve. So we're in a very sensitive environment in that area, and we want to be sensitive to that. We want to do what we can with the technology that we have and understanding that we have in order to keep that preserved as much as possible. So what you're seeing in those pictures are some of the results of that. And I'm pretty proud of that it looks terrible maybe to the guy driving by. If they were to see that, maybe somebody who would apply Roundup to that field and put beans in there, had them planted in mid-May, and maybe ran tile drainage through that field early to get it cleaned up and apply chemicals to it. It definitely looked ugly to them, and maybe to some financial institutions, they don't want to see those kinds of pictures. But to us who are doing the actual work and the stewardship and paying the bills and financing, those are beautiful pictures to me. And that's what we want to see. And that's what we want to see on our farm on every acre. And we want to encourage both farmers and but what we need to do this, but what we need is support from our communities to do these things. And whether it's through authoritative measures or promotion from within the market, I think we want to have these things, that these acres can be covered in different ways than what's typical out there, what we see.
What stands out to me from that photo, the clump of earth that you pulled out the ground, is the roots.
Look at the exploration that those roots have been able to do, and that's what you need. Soil is made up of soil, air, and water. So it's about You could say that 25% of your oil is air. And where you're losing a lot of production is the infiltration of water and air in that soil. So if you're constantly packing your soil with tillage practices, or you're using chemicals or a short rotation of just corn and soybeans, if you're relying on chemistry instead of biology to make your plants grow, you're not going to see that abundant root growth. So there you see in that picture, you see the earth is very fine and crumbly. It's a clay that's not packed and tightly together because I haven't touched it, Rob. I haven't done anything to it. I haven't adulterated it. But the growth and the activity is still there. It can't wait to get going. The biology is activated, and those roots will grow in great length and abundance. And to geek out on biology here a little bit, what those roots eat are what's called exudates. And the exudates are basically, I guess you could say, ice cream and cookies, literally. The same compounds that you'd find in ice cream and cookies are what these plants are eating. They're eating carbohydrates and sugars. And they're not eating the chemical and minerals that we have available to us to apply to those fields. It's actually the biology that turns those rocks and minerals into something that the plant can eat. You have to remember, these plants, these roots, they don't have mouths. They don't have a drill bit on it like the same as what's in those mines in Saskatchewan for mining potassium. They have biological, chemical methods in order to break down fertilizer.
God as a designer does it so much more elegantly, because where we need a drill bit with, PSIs and stuff like that to break open a rock, give a root enough time and it'll break through rock. No problem. Nature's patient. And there's an elegance there.
Nature's patient and persistent and fiscally responsible as well.
It runs a balanced budget. And if it doesn't, and if we try to mess with that budget, eventually bad things happen. Tell me about this one. This is the one I want to know about because it's cute. Is the mommy cow and the baby.
Okay, that's a picture of one of our Jersey cows, and she just had a baby calf, and she's in her pen with her mom, and she's going to probably get up and eat from her mom pretty soon. Just like you'd picture from a farm, we have a calf would drink from her mom. And that picture there is a cow that we've had in our herd, and she's now milking, and her calf is still alive. We have to treat our calves very carefully. They're very, very susceptible to disease, and we have to be very careful as to how we look after our calves.
This is not universally done to have the calf with the mother, right?
That's correct. This is where the science of the world comes in that there's procedural processes that we're put under by medicine and veterinary medicine. And I can speak about veterinary medicine and not veterinarians themselves, because we don't want to, veterinarians, part of their job is to save animals' lives, and we're very grateful for that profession. But their profession has definitely changed in the light where there has been an emphasis more on treatment of the animal. And part of that treatment is adhering to processes on the farm. We try and adhere to a lot of processes that are proven. We also want to be able to understand processes of our own and what works for the farm. As agriculture has become more dependent on finances, these procedures become more and more arduous and more rigorous and scientific and measurable. And we try and control nature as much as possible. And we're finding out some of the weaknesses that some of the risk mitigation strategies that we're taking using these treatments aren't necessarily all they're cut out to be. So we try and do things that maybe you won't find in the latest idea of how to keep animals healthy. Some of them work, some of them don't. But it's a challenging job to keep animals healthy, and we try and do our best to do as little as possible to keep them healthy and do it a natural way. And we're going to keep working on that and improving it here on our operation. So I'll take a picture posted the middle of June from the field where I was cultivating. in the previous pictures that I was discussing about some of the stewardship ideas that we are trying to enact on our farm and some of the philosophy that we believe from our farm. And it's a picture of some cows. I'm looking across a small creek or stream, and it's some pictures of some cows out on pasture. And there's about a 50 or 60 acre pasture that I rent to a friend of mine so that he can feed his cows on for the summer. And that's really what we're trying to do, is get animals back out on the land. We're trying to have a commercial operation that produces food, to juxtapose that against a commercial operation that produces a commodity.
And that's something we're going to get into. But just to be clear, factory farming doesn't like grazing like in that picture.
Well, it's very hard. It's very difficult to do. And like, these animals will probably end up in a feedlot somewhere closer to a city to be raised on pure corn. But this is a part of their life that they spend, say, half of it outside, and the rest is going to be spent jammed in a outdoor confinement area where they're treated, where they have to be medicated until they're and fed, because what they're being fed is making them sick. These animals are on a fast food diet, the same thing you'd buy at McDonald's. These cattle are on high carbohydrate, high corn, high sugar diet, high processed food diet until they're taken to slaughter. We're advocating you eat meat, but we're advocating where you get your meat from as well. So eat good meat, and that may cost you a little bit more money, but that may not cost you a little bit more money in today's economy, as these markets have completely disintegrated to the point where they are no longer markets anymore.
The way I have put it is, we have a way of looking at healthy food and sort of thinking, I have to pay more for healthy food, or there's a tax on healthy food. And that's the wrong way to think about it. The way to think about it is more that there's a subsidy on bad food, because you're going to pay the price for the food that you eat. You're either going to pay it out of your wallet, or you're going to pay it with your body and the environment. And the argument is, eventually you're going to regret not paying for it with your wallet.
That's a good point. Is the externalities, is those externalities cost you whether you pay it or not. And I'm going to throw the statistic out that I've brought up to Rob before, in that 40 years ago, and I'll have to reference Gabe Brown on this, he brought this up, and he's working with Dr. Kurt Busch in order to tie some of the healthcare causes that food that we're eating could be causing. And we'll go into that in further episodes. But Gabe Brown talks about how 30 years ago, our food bill was 33%, our food costs were 33% of our annual budget, and our healthcare costs were 17% of our annual personal budget. Now we have the exact inverse in families, where healthcare costs are 33% of our budget and food costs are 17% of our budget. For those requesting sources, I will discuss those at a later date, but that's a good way to think about how what we're eating affects us. That's an externality that is literally upon us.
The news roundup. Yeah. So this is the news roundup, where we're going to talk about some things that have been happening in the rural world, the farming world. And we've got a selection of things from around the English-speaking world. If you find something that looks interesting, send it to us. We'd love to see it. We'd love to include it. But this is just a sample to give you guys an idea of what's going on in the farming world. And I'll just say this: the rural world, the farming world, moves a bit slower. And so very often the news isn't some breaking thing that's just happened. It's what people are talking about that week. And there's a few examples that will recur in conversation. And it's what's noteworthy about them is, what are farmers talking about? What are they reading? What are they thinking? So if you hear things come up more than once, that's why. And a great one about that is out of the UK, where we're going to start today. And this is from the Farmer's Guardian from the week of July 9th. And it's talking about vaccines, but not the vaccine you're thinking about. I'm not talking about COVID, but bovine tuberculosis. And if, for those of you not in Britain, bovine tuberculosis is a problem that the UK has, with particular reference to badgers. And badgers will get in close proximity to cattle, either touching them, gnawing on them, or the waste products that a badger produces, cows getting too close to that sort of stuff. It will give them bovine tuberculosis. And there's a big debate about what should we do about this. And frankly, the reasonable thing is culling badgers. And we have far too many badgers in the UK at the moment. Population control isn't being done. But unfortunately, Guardian readers, for those of you who don't know, that's the equivalent to the New York Times, don't like the idea of killing cute little badgers. But badgers are giving bovine tuberculosis to cows, and they're also destroying the ecosystem downstream from badgers, eating up hedgehogs, which are one of their favorite snacks. And we have a record low number of hedgehogs, and hedgehogs like to eat slugs and snails, which record population at the moment because they're not getting eating. So one of the solutions that they're talking about now is a vaccine for bovine tuberculosis. But as I think you'll guess, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm guessing Erik doesn't think that's a good idea because the benefits of this aren't obvious. First off, we're looking for another thing to inject into cows. And the other thing is the stats don't seem to bear out that this is something that we need to worry about too much in terms of having it in our meat. About 1% of the UK tuberculosis cases in humans are from bovine TB, which is about 40 people a year. The majority of those people that have it are over 45, and it could just be old infections. The big point of this story is failure of stewardship. We're not calling the badgers, and so we're looking for a scientific solution, which goes back to something we talked about earlier. No doubt bovine tuberculosis is a problem, but the solution is stewardship, not more science.
It's a great topic to bring up, and it's something that we understand a lot in the industry and the power of vaccines.
Do you guys have bovine TB out there?
It's not an issue here, and we don't have the badger population here, and we do certainly have wildlife, but being able to draw the line between badgers and tuberculosis is, I hate to rain on somebody's parade, but I think it's a bit of a stretch. Now, there may be science or data that proves this, but it's also, I tend to question, and Rob and I are familiar with some of these terms, is the consensus making apparatus and how they use science as an institution versus imperial evidence. And it sounds to me that it's not that they have nefarious intentions, but what these people have is maybe a lack of understanding of the issues and exactly what happens when you interfere in nature, and that the continual interference in nature may be beneficial to some of these parties, some of these structures. But the question I have is it going to solve the problem, or is this just a problem for science, the institution? And ultimately, we don't know. Personally, I'm against tuberculosis, and I'm against killing badgers as well.
We do need to kill badgers in the UK. The bovine TB thing is just one of the reasons, but I can also tell you that 75% of cases in the UK in cows, it's coming from badgers.
And we remember there was a time before pasteurization with milk, and milk was causing tuberculosis. There was entire hospitals that were devoted to curing tuberculosis. And we learned in the dairy industry to pasteurize our milk. And once you pasteurize our milk, tuberculosis was no longer an issue. We're not pro tuberculosis. Nobody's pro tuberculosis, but we have to understand what we're doing, what the interference is that we're running, and how do we handle that. And vaccines are a great tool. They can be very beneficial, but they're also very powerful. It's worth understanding the amount of power that you want to use. And it's especially pertinent in the living environment and the interaction between nature and human beings. And often that happens to fall in the lap of the local farmer and the food that he's producing. So we want to be able to understand that better and be able to mitigate our risks. Because some of these scientific institutions have given us wonderful tools, but they haven't always best understood or been able to be accountable to the results of those tools, the results of the wonderful technology that they've given us. And this story could be one of those examples.
Yep, that story is not pro-badger or anti-badger culling for me. It's very much skepticism about scientific cures for bovine tuberculosis is what I'm going to have to say. Moving on, the other big thing that's come up in the UK is in a number of editorials in farming magazines, both in Farmers Guardian and Farmers Weekly, about carbon credit skepticism. And it seems like there's more or less 4 areas of objection coming up. Measurement problems. How much carbon have I actually sequestered? Ownership problems. If I'm a tenant farmer, do I actually own the carbon I've put in to sell? Selling the carbon itself. Where do I sell it? What markets are there for it? And valuation. Am I getting enough for this carbon? Currently, it sounds like it's a bit undervalued. It's trading at about £20 a ton at the moment. I've heard estimates, though, that it's really closer to 70 if you're going to really do it, and that we should expect by end of decade to be selling carbon for £70 a ton.
Well, this is again a terminology here and understanding the consensus making apparatus. None of these things are false. These are exact true, and these are good questions, and they are areas of objection. And it's something, carbon credits is something that farmers have talked about for the last 20 years. And there has not been an answer for carbon credits themselves. And my opinion is that carbon credits are the way for institutional organizations to maintain their hegemony. I don't think it's anything. I think what carbon credits are meant to do is to maintain current structures and the way they operate and continue to keep doing what they're doing and use carbon credits as a justification for that. And an example that I'll use is the oil and gas industry is coming up with technologies, algorithms, measurements, where they're saying they're sequestering carbon. Agriculture itself hasn't looked into those ways of measuring it because there is no money going into it. The carbon credit system is completely failed at this point to have any farmer understand it, or there has been no actual investment into it or understanding into it. There are structures and organizations that are trying. The farmers are being receptive, but there's no way that anybody has any idea what they're doing about it up to this point.
That leads into this next one for a number of reasons, 2 reasons, but it also goes back to what you're talking about earlier about institutions getting involved. There definitely seems to be a failure on the part of people to understand that you need people at the bottom who are actually have to do things to be on side with whatever plan that you're putting out. Speaking of carbon, farmers have staged a large protest in most New Zealand cities. Farmers claim that the New Zealand Labour government has pushed through a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing recent environmental regulation. The legislation they put forward is designed to address polluted waterways, loss of indigenous wildlife and biodiversity, quote, risky practices. I don't know what that means. And of course, commitments to reduce carbon. Farmers have conceded that these need to be addressed and are currently being addressed, and improvements are happening all the time, but that the measures the government have put forward are going to hurt farming. New Zealand's babysitter, Jacinda Ardern, said that the government, quote, had been working closely with farmers to address environmental challenges and rejected the suggestion that there was a growing divide between rural and urban areas. So there's a number of things there. Um, One is that it's more top down. You need people on side who are going to be doing this. She couldn't be further from the truth, as far as I can tell. There is nothing but an ever growing divide between rural and urban areas. And you just need to look at the 2020 election to see the way American voters went based upon where they're located. And the same goes for Australia's elections. The same goes for New Zealand's elections. The same goes for Britain's elections. And I'm guessing Canada. People vote one particular way in rural areas, and they tend to vote the exact opposite way in urban areas. So it seems like there's nothing but an ever increasing cultural divide between the two.
Well, populist democracy does have its weaknesses. That much I will say. I have some intimate knowledge about this last article that you brought out in New Zealand, and I really know what's driving this and what the results are that what we'll say the overseeing structures are looking to generate in New Zealand. And you have to understand, I don't think that really the purpose of these regulations aren't wrong, but it's the application that what they're trying to do is Jacinda Ardern is well versed in this, and the consensus making apparatus that she represents is well versed in it. And that by simply stating the fact of the growing divide between the rural and urban areas, she is pitting the public opinion against the urban population. We can talk about that last line ad nauseum. I have an intimate knowledge about this particular issue because of some of the work that I have been doing and some of the exposure that I've had to, we'll say, white papers of certain organizations. An investment funded research firm had shown a white paper focusing on the New Zealand dairy industry, which is the largest industry in New Zealand. They're the largest exporter of milk in the world. They're the fourth largest beef exporter in the world. And the New Zealand economy, after the economic collapse that they had in the late 80s, early 90s, correct me if I'm wrong, really focused on dairy production and rural improvement and rebuilding the rural environment. And there's been a recent change in the New Zealand government of the deputy prime minister. And we can research his name afterwards. But after the deputy prime minister had left, he was the one leading the charge against any kind of adulteration to the New Zealand dairy industry. It was hands off in Parliament for the New Zealand dairy industry for his entire tenure. And he was the deputy minister and held a lot of power within that government.
In Australia and New Zealand, you'll find guys in government that are really prepared to go to bat for farmers. They're not always successful at it, but they've got some guys who really care down there. Doesn't quite seem to be the case in America or the UK, and you'll have to tell me about Canada. They appreciate it down there. They really do appreciate it. And the guy who comes to mind, he might as well be the saint of farmers, the political saint of farmers, Bob Catter. Incredible guy, great guy, and his whole career was spent fighting for farmers, knowing that, hey, this is the industry we can never get rid of. You don't need spaceships, you don't need airplanes, but you're always going to need food on the table.
There are great people. As much as we dump on government and regulations and agriculture, we participate in a great program in Canada that definitely helps farmers in rural communities and strengthens rural communities in the dairy industry. And we see other areas that have completely fallen off the map. And when they don't have government support and structural support in the industry, what can really happen is there's terrible externalities pushed away and terrible consequences. So there are good people, people like Minister Catter and I believe it's Minister Whitaker in New Zealand. And when we don't have structural support in agriculture, we tend to lose focus of the importance of it until somebody comes along and straightens us out again. So those are subjects for another farm, but I do have intimate knowledge of really the inner workings of what's trying to happen, what is trying to be done in New Zealand. And it's going to be ground zero for a lot of carbon, but they're looking to get rid of 25% of the dairy farmers there. That's the end goal, which is really sad, but they're taking the measures to make it happen.
Not a lot coming out of the United States this week that I could find. But the biggest thing that I sort of stuck out to me was news of a bill coming through committee, HR 4374, that is going to improve, if it gets through, $43 billion to connect rural communities to high-speed internet.
Oh, it's a big improvement. We need more of it, as much as we can get of it as possible. I do think this news article in particular may be more hand waving. It's a pretty complicated subject, rural internet. A lot of funding dollars have been pumped into it, and they get sucked up in infrastructure. It's a bit of a bottomless pit. It's a headline, and interacting with that, they may have to continue to do $43 billion next year to bring it back up on the radar. But I just want to touch on something quickly. The reason that you don't hear a lot about U.S. agriculture is the amount of corporatization that is involved in U.S. agriculture, and what a global Goliath that the U.S. agriculture is. I mean, U.S. is, the superpower, quote unquote, but what makes them the superpower is their control of global agricultural trade. So you won't hear about it. There won't be news about it because most of it is corporately controlled. So the press releases that will be done by the large corporations within the U.S. Will be very controlled once they get depressed.
Moving up to your neck of the woods, Eric, I came across a story that I found in the Star, which is, I believe, Toronto's newspaper.
Yes, it's the Guardian or the New York Times of Toronto. And if it's Canadian, it's a cheap knockoff of both of those publications.
Here it is. The desire to buy local is on the rise in Canada. It seems like there's two reasons for this. One is increased costs due to the pandemic and current commodity situation. Two, the increased concerns over health and environmental impacts. Again, increasingly being aware of because of the pandemic.
We're getting word now that these are issues. Food inflation is an important subject because of its relevance, and we're really seeing the collapse of supply chains affecting the food industry. And I'll touch on this quickly, but food is real. If the stock market, if your stock portfolio increases by 20%, maybe that money isn't really tangible, but the money you spend on groceries is tangible.
And then lastly, in Australia, they are anticipating what I think can only be described as a crippling shortage of labor in the harvest this year. In 2019, typical year, there were 120,000 international agricultural workers. Last year, there were 20,000, so a sixth. And it looks like this year it's going to be even worse. So they're talking about potentially an 80-90% drop in the seasonal labor available. This is a big deal for a lot of nations with decent agriculture sectors, is skilled seasonal labor. I know New Zealand's having similar things. Their farmers are really frustrated about what's going on. Australia is, I'm guessing again, Canada is. But this is a reoccurring theme, isn't it, Eric? And around the English speaking world, it seems like we're starting to experience a real imbalance in the distribution of labor. How do we get these kids to stop being TikTok influencers and start driving tractors?
That problem is a reoccurring historical problem that has had a lot of impacts that are stretching throughout our years. But the structures and the models have remained the same, where we used to use human power, inserted machinery back into producing large amounts of commodities in order to satisfy the global market and feeding things and moving things all over the world. So when you have the models that work on those distribution and logistical models of global finance and global economy, you're going to have labor shortages in certain areas. These things are going to exist. So if you want to get TikTok influencers out and getting their hands dirty, there's a couple different ways. And the first way, the biggest way, is a way where you can authoritize or create a model where people can provide themselves with their own food, even if it's limited. And I'll take something like vertical farms that you could grow in your own house. You can maybe grow your own spinach, your own lettuce, your own microgreens, your own fresh greens in your house. You can maybe grow a garden. And if you're really adventurous, you can maybe have a couple chickens. I mean, that's how we're going to solve these large scale problems, is a little bit at a time in your own environment, under your own methods of stewardship, to create a better life for yourself through food.
I left this one as the last one. Going back to what I said at the beginning, a little bit of propaganda, a little bit of motivation. There are real opportunities out in the rural economy for guys. And I said this one to show that, like, hey, they need people out on farms. How long would it take a guy who already has a basic license to be able to drive a tractor on a farm? How, like, what's the timeline for that, Erik?
Let's look at it a bigger way. My theory around the farm is if you drive the tractor, you got to make the payments. So let's just throw that out the window for a second.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah, see, the farm I was on, the tractor driving I was doing, he did not want to do. So to take a
Yeah.
little diversion here, I was up in Iceland, and it was a field that had never been worked before. And so I had this giant rake on the back of the tractor that dug into the ground and picked up any big rocks. And when I hit a rock that made a certain sound, my job was to get out and, I'm talking like 30, 40, 50 kilo rocks that, if they got so big, I'd have to use the bucket on the front to dig them up. And I was out, probably 3 miles away from the nearest human, out there by myself in the mud. And looking back, I'm not surprised you didn't want to do it. And I did throw my back out once, so that wasn't that wasn't fun. But yeah, fair enough. I would, if I was making the payments, I'd want to be driving my big old case.
That was such a great story. I've lost my train of thought, but sincerely, it's an excellent example of what it takes to do the job, and somebody like yourself being able to do that job. That's a pretty tough one. But what I want to think about it is I'll take a step back from that and take a more higher perspective in that. What if we start thinking about or creating models where instead of the service industry being filled by 20-year-olds who process or service your food, bring you the food, what about and the transformation that has happened when the young people in your family from as young as age 7 or 6 or younger who worked on the farm to be able to produce your food? That's the biggest transformation. I mean, who runs these the McDonald's restaurants? Who runs these kids, these young men, young women, and even kids? They were made to work on the farm before. That's what they were doing. They were making food. They were doing the chores on the farm. They were the ones shoveling the manure. They were the ones picking the eggs, weeding the fields. The teenagers, the young men, the young women, children were the workforce of the agricultural community. And they still remain to be to the workforce of the food community, but we've externalized their work into menial service jobs of minimum wage, where they learn very few life skills. So maybe the lesson we can take from that question is then how do we get young men and women back to, instead of being in the food service industry, how can we get men and women back into the food production industry? And that's maybe where they're more traditionally suited and can bring the game in, because as you've said, it's a young man's game. It's physical work. No matter how many tractors and how much technology and science can be thrown at us, there's physical restrictions to these jobs. It's hands-on, whether we like it or not. We can't simply, no matter how much drone technology we have, we still got to go out and fix things and use our hands and use our physicality.
Off the top of your head, if there is someone listening to this who goes, I want to get out there, can he do it now? Can he do it tomorrow if the job's there? Is there easy entry into these sorts of jobs that don't require skills that he might not have? Can he pick it up on the job?
No matter where you are in the world, you can find a farmer who's looking for some help. And some of us, some farmers are absolutely desperate to share their workload with people.
I have to say, I think it's absolutely win-win. You're going to help them, but they're going to liberate you. If you want it, they're going to give you a chance to get out of your substandard life. So if you're thinking about it, if you're looking for something to do, if you're looking for a mission, there are far, far worse things that you can do than get out on a farm.
So walk, run, bike, take a bus, hitchhike, take a car if you own a car, get outside of the city and knock on some doors and some farm driveways and ask how you can help. And if it doesn't work out on that farm, you can go to the next one and help them there and try and do something to contribute and showing up, being somebody that shows up every day and shows integrity. And this is something you can really do. I often refer to the movie Napoleon Dynamite, where they were picking chickens, and the two old farmers broke into it after the hard work. A day was done where they were picking chickens in the chicken barn. The farmers served them raw eggs for lunch, and the two old farmers then broke open the change purse, and they each got 35 cents for a day's work. You're not going to get rich, but putting farmhand or farm worker on your resume when you go in to enter your career maybe win out over some other candidates if you find the right character company to work for. So that's something that I encourage young people to do. It's not easy. I had to do it myself, and Rob had a venture in that as well, but it's definitely a lot of opportunity for young women and men to participate in farming, in agriculture, and in producing food instead of servicing the food industry. And if you like it enough, there are opportunities out there for you to start your own farm.
It's worth going out there for a year or two as a way of figuring out who you are, because you're going to work hard, and the clarity of mind that you're going to have at the end of the day is going to be like nothing you've ever experienced before. And you'll be able to figure out who you are and what you're made of. And I don't think I'm over egging it by saying that I suspect going and spending a couple of years on a farm would be a similar sort of character building thing that people often talk about the military. I really don't think that is overstating it. That it can have that sort of change on you, because you need to step up.
The structures are in agriculture and they're there in the military. They're comparable in some sense and not in others, but there are certainly structures that lend to character development, and agriculture is one of those, or farming is one of those structures that lends to it.
Watch this space for the Laurentian Volunteer Corps coming soon.
Well, there's lots to do on the farm today. We didn't get to everything we wanted to, but the animals are calling and we need feed for the cattle today. In summation, we covered some things that we'll be talking about further in further episodes. And what we want to do on the next episode, Rob, I think you're in with me, is to start looking at the discussion between food and commodity, and what we have been eating in the last 30 years and how it's transitioned from food into a commodity, and what some of the results are in society are of those things. And we'll be able to cover a great blog post by Will Harris from White Oak Pastures, who's doing wonderful things down in Bluffton, Georgia for his local community through food. So those are the things we're going to discuss in the next episode. And then after that, we've got a lot of material to cover, because this isn't something that's talked about very often or in great detail, especially with farmers. Farmers don't have a lot of ability to communicate their ideas or willingness for that matter. So our audience is pretty lucky. They get my time and Rob's experience in the industry as well to help understand and maybe give us a bit of an idea of how to move forward on this subject, because it is very important and it goes beyond anything ideological or that we understand. It's a lot deeper than we give it credit for. So we're here to help people and walk people through it.